For years, Diana's private legacy had existed behind locked doors, whispered about, but never fully confronted. Then came the confirmation that changed the atmosphere inside the palace in minutes. Senior archivists formally established that a protected portion of Diana's estate had been sealed specifically for Catherine. And when Princess Anne learned that Camilla had questioned what the restriction actually meant, she did not send an aide. She went to confront her herself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne read the final paragraph twice, and the second reading changed her expression completely. The Princess Royal, an official title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, understood this was no ordinary filing decision. Archivists had confirmed that a protected collection tied to Diana's private estate had been deliberately separated from wider royal holdings and reserved for Catherine. Personal correspondence, ceremonial possessions, family records, and deeply significant objects were therefore protected from being absorbed into Camilla's personal royal sphere. That mattered because these were not decorative pieces. They carried memories William had lived with since losing his mother. Catherine felt no triumph when the confirmation reached her. She immediately understood the burden behind it. The Princess of Wales, William's wife and the woman expected to stand beside the future king, had effectively been entrusted with preserving part of Diana's private legacy for the family that followed. William knew what that responsibility meant, and Catherine knew every decision she made could touch wounds her husband had carried for decades. What looked like privilege from outside felt painfully personal inside the family. Anne grew colder when a senior archivist explained, through a documented archival memorandum, that the wording had been intentional from the beginning. Diana's collection had been separated through explicit instructions designed to keep control within her intended family line. Then came the detail that changed everything. Camilla had already requested clarification about who could access the protected material. The request itself revealed no motive, but Anne saw the danger immediately. Once that boundary was questioned, someone might eventually try to reinterpret it. An aide quietly suggested that Charles should handle the matter. Anne closed the file before he finished. The king, Britain's reigning monarch and head of the royal household, would be informed, but she refused to let another palace discussion blur what had just been confirmed. She would speak to Camilla personally. Catherine remained unsettled as William absorbed what the seal meant for Diana's memory, while Anne moved toward the private rooms. The documents had answered the legal question. They had not answered the human one. And before Anne reached that door, the story had to turn to the three women whose histories made one sealed collection far more explosive than any ordinary inheritance. The archive may have contained objects and papers, but the real conflict was never about objects. For Catherine, Diana's legacy represented a woman she never met, but whose absence shaped the man she married. For Anne, it represented family history that could not simply be rewritten. And for Camilla, the confirmation created something more uncomfortable, a boundary from the past that remained powerful enough to dictate the present. Catherine sat with the weight of that truth, rather than the privilege of it. As William's wife and the mother of the next generation, she understood that Diana's private legacy carried more than sentimental value. The Princess of Wales, a title held by the wife of the Prince of Wales and tied to the future monarchy, was now being asked to protect memories that belonged emotionally to her husband before they belonged to history. William watched her carefully, knowing why that distinction mattered. William heard her admit that the responsibility felt less like receiving something and more like being handed someone else's unfinished story. Catherine knew she could never replace Diana, and she had no desire to try. Yet every letter preserved, every family record protected, and every object kept from reassignment would one day shape how their children understood the grandmother they never knew. The future king saw the strain in her restraint, and the archive felt suddenly personal. Anne approached the matter differently, but no less emotionally. She had spent a lifetime respecting precedent, duty, and the line separating crown property from deeply personal family possessions. When she reviewed the documented archival memorandum, she discovered that Catherine's designation was not ceremonial. Custodial authority, meaning the practical right to protect, control access to, and eventually pass forward a collection, had been written into the instructions with deliberate force. Anne read that language again and understood why it mattered. Camilla felt the same wording as a barrier. When the archivist's interpretation was relayed to her through a formal written account, she reacted privately with frustration, because almost no room remained for discretionary access. Diana's memory, even decades later, could still change the emotional temperature of the palace in an instant. The queen consort understood that painful reality, and she understood that challenging it openly would only deepen the wound. William then learned there was a second sealed notation attached to the instructions, one explaining why Catherine had been chosen instead of Charles, or even William himself. That discovery changed the mood again. The notation pointed backward, toward one specific palace incident everyone had tried to leave buried. To understand why the seal existed at all, the palace had to revisit the single uncomfortable encounter that turned private unease into a permanent instruction. Long before archivists confirmed Catherine's position, one meeting had already determined the direction of Diana's private legacy. It happened during a closed inventory review, when a ceremonial item connected to Diana was unexpectedly placed among possessions being considered for wider royal use. The room changed instantly. A quiet objection became a confrontation, a family disagreement became a warning, and from that afternoon came the instruction that would eventually place an entire protected collection beyond ordinary palace discretion. William noticed the item before anyone could move past it. The private inventory review, a formal process used to separate institutional royal holdings from personal family possessions, was supposed to be routine, but this entry was different. It was one of Diana's personal ceremonial pieces, and its appearance on a reassignment list struck him like a warning. The prince objected immediately, saying his mother's belongings should never become symbols passed around simply because palace convenience made it possible. Anne backed him without hesitation. She understood why that distinction mattered. Because crown property belonged to the institution, while personal family possessions carried memories, grief, and private ownership that could not be treated in the same way. The Princess Royal argued that once Diana's items were absorbed into wider ceremonial use, the family might never fully recover the line between remembrance and institutional display. William heard support in her words, but he also heard something harder: fear that the past could be rewritten by procedure. Camilla challenged that position. She questioned whether locking emotionally significant objects away forever would protect Diana's memory or turn it into something untouchable, frozen beyond meaningful use. The queen consort did not present the argument as an attack, yet the room tightened around it. Anne heard danger in the suggestion, while William heard something more personal. To him, the issue was not whether the items could still serve the monarchy, it was whether his mother's private legacy would remain hers. That exchange changed everything. According to the documented account later attached to the archive, private instructions were drafted soon after the meeting to isolate a defined group of Diana's possessions, correspondence, and family records from future reassignment. The sealed estate collection at the center of the present crisis began there, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a direct response to that confrontation. William then learned why Catherine had eventually been named within the second notation. She was considered uniquely able to protect Diana's legacy without treating it as personal ownership or political ammunition. Anne understood the implication immediately. Camilla's recent access inquiry had touched the exact boundary created after that old dispute. The past had written the rule, the archivists had confirmed it, and now Anne was standing outside Camilla's door prepared to enforce it face to face. There were no secretaries between them when Princess Anne entered. No lawyers, no courtiers prepared to soften a sentence before it landed. Camilla was already waiting, aware that the archival decision had reached the family. Anne placed the file down but never pushed it across the table. She did not need to. Both women understood what it contained. What neither knew was whether the conversation would remain about Diana or become about them. Anne spoke first, and she did not soften the point. The archivists had confirmed Catherine's exclusive custodial position over the sealed portion of Diana's private estate. Custodial authority meant practical control over how a protected collection was preserved, accessed, and eventually passed forward. The Princess Royal made clear that she had not come to renegotiate that decision. She had come because palace staff should not be pressured to search for loopholes inside wording that had already been settled. Camilla stiffened at the implication. She insisted that her earlier inquiry had never been an attempt to seize Diana's possessions, and the Queen Consort said her concern had been procedural. Whether historically important material could remain permanently inaccessible inside a private archive. Anne listened, but her expression did not change. She answered that intention was no longer the only issue. After decades of emotional complication around Diana, even asking for an exception could reopen wounds the family had spent years trying to contain. Camilla pushed back harder. She asked whether Charles agreed that Anne had the right to confront her this way, and for a moment the silence grew heavier than the argument. Anne admitted she had not sought his permission. The king's discretion, his authority to make decisions as monarch, did not erase private instructions created before his reign, she said. That was precisely why she had come herself. Charles could respect the boundary, but he could not casually rewrite what the archive had confirmed. Anne then delivered the sentence Camilla had been dreading. Catherine would decide when the sealed collection was opened, how it was handled, and what happened to its contents. Not the Queen, not Charles, not the wider household. The words landed with brutal simplicity, because there was nothing left to interpret. Camilla's anger faded into stunned silence when Anne added that William already knew. The prince had received the archival confirmation, and his response would decide whether this remained a private family dispute or became something larger. Anne had defended the boundary, but enforcing it permanently required something more powerful than anger. Control over the machinery that decides what the palace can and cannot touch. Behind the confrontation was a colder reality. Palaces survive on rules, and rules survive only when someone possesses the authority to enforce them. Catherine's name on the sealed instruction carried emotional power, but the archivists now had to determine what that meant in practice. Could the king override it? Could another senior royal request temporary access? Or had Diana's private instructions created something even royal authority was expected to respect? Charles read the interpretation alone, and the silence around him became its own answer. The sealed estate was being treated as a protected private family collection rather than ordinary crown property, meaning it sat outside the normal pool of possessions controlled for institutional royal use. That distinction mattered because the monarch could exercise authority over the crown, but personal family property followed different rules. The king removed his glasses, set them beside the file, and understood exactly where intervention would place him. Catherine felt the pressure from another direction. She told William that she would protect Diana's collection completely, but she refused to let it become a weapon against Camilla. The prince understood what she meant. Preserving his mother's legacy mattered, because those letters, possessions, and private records connected his children to a grandmother they had never known. Yet humiliating another woman in Diana's name would turn preservation into revenge, and Catherine wanted no part of that. Charles kept reading as household legal officers clarified the difference between institutional authority and custodial authority. Custodial authority meant the practical right to protect, approve access to, catalog, and eventually pass forward personal property without treating it as part of the monarch's general estate. The written interpretation concluded that Catherine could authorize preservation, private viewing, cataloging, and future family transfer, while refusing discretionary reassignment. The wording was careful, its consequence was not. William saw the significance immediately when Catherine showed him the interpretation. She had not been handed a ceremonial honor. She had been given real control. The future king also understood that if his father challenged the arrangement, the dispute would stop being about procedure and become a direct conflict between Charles, Camilla, Diana's expressed wishes, and his own family. Charles made his decision without ceremony. He would not challenge the arrangement. The monarch chose to let Catherine's custodianship stand untouched, and that quiet refusal to interfere carried more weight than any public declaration could have done. Camilla would receive no institutional rescue, no special exception, and no royal reinterpretation. Once Charles stepped aside, the question stopped being who could challenge the seal, and became what Camilla would lose because nobody intended to challenge it. The first consequence was almost painfully small. Camilla did not lose a title, a residence, or a public role. She simply received a revised access note from the archival office, stating that all requests involving Diana's protected collection would now be routed through Catherine's custodial authority. 1 page. A few formal lines. Yet as Camilla read them alone, the meaning was unmistakable. The boundary Anne had described was already becoming real. Camilla read the notice again, slower this time, as if different wording might appear on the second pass. The archival office, the palace department responsible for preserving and controlling access to historical records and protected collections, had changed its procedures immediately. Any request involving Diana's sealed estate now required Catherine's authorization. Staff who once referred difficult questions upward through the sovereign's household were told to treat the material as a separate protected family archive. That mattered, because the change turned an emotional dispute into an operating rule. Camilla's first reaction was anger. She had believed Charles might still challenge the interpretation, or at least ask that some flexibility remain, but his silence now carried its own meaning. The queen consort began to understand that no intervention was coming. What hurt was not simply the restriction. It was the realization that everyone around her had already adjusted to a system in which the door could close without her consent. Charles entered later, and the conversation was brief because neither of them wanted to say too much. Camilla asked whether his refusal to intervene meant he agreed with Anne's judgment of her intentions. The king answered carefully. Respecting Diana's instruction, he told her, was not the same as condemning her. He would not accuse her of motives he could not prove, but he would not overturn a boundary created specifically to protect private family property either. Camilla then learned something she had not expected. Catherine had already issued her first decision as custodian. Nothing from the collection would be displayed, reassigned, loaned, or discussed publicly while the family adjusted to the new arrangement. There would be no symbolic victory lap, no public gesture, no attempt to turn Diana's belongings into proof that another woman had lost. Anne was surprised when that decision reached her through the written archival instruction. She had expected Catherine to defend the collection fiercely, but she had not expected her to protect Camilla from further embarrassment at the same time. That restraint changed the emotional direction of the crisis. The seal had separated possessions, but Catherine was about to decide whether it would also permanently separate the people still living beneath Diana's shadow. When Catherine finally sat opposite Anne, there were no archivists waiting outside, and no official papers between them. The crisis had already produced enough paperwork. Catherine wanted something simpler, a private understanding. Anne expected gratitude for defending Diana's instructions. Instead, Catherine surprised her. She said the collection should remain sealed, absolutely, but she also refused to let its existence become proof that one woman had defeated another. Diana's legacy, she insisted, deserved something more dignified. Catherine spoke with quiet certainty. She would fully exercise the custodial responsibility entrusted to her, and she would not surrender control of the protected collection. Custodial responsibility meant the duty to preserve, manage, and approve access to private family material without treating it as personal property. That distinction mattered to her because the archive was not a prize. It was a responsibility carried on behalf of William, their children, and the memory of a woman whose absence had shaped their family long before Catherine entered it. For Catherine, that difference was essential. Ownership could feed rivalry, while stewardship forced her to think beyond herself and toward the family still to come. Anne listened, then admitted something she had not said before. Her confrontation with Camilla had not been driven only by the access request. Years of frustration had been sitting beneath it. Old arguments, old loyalties, and the exhaustion of watching Diana's memory become a source of tension again and again. The Princess Royal knew she had defended the boundary, but she also knew anger had traveled into the room with her. Catherine challenged her gently. Protecting Diana, she said, meant less if the family used that protection to keep old resentments alive forever. William had already carried enough of that burden. She would not add to it by turning the sealed collection into proof that Camilla had lost and someone else had won. The past could be protected without being weaponized. Catherine then made her decision. When the time was right, William and their children would review the collection privately, as a family, before any wider historical consideration was discussed. The prince would not encounter his mother's legacy through headlines, and the next generation would meet that history first, as family, not institution. Anne accepted the decision. She told Catherine that this restraint was precisely why the original instructions had trusted her, and she agreed to step back from further confrontation. What had begun as a fight over access was becoming something larger, a decision about who would define Diana's legacy, when public curiosity finally broke through the palace walls. Inside the family, the temperature had finally fallen, but outside the gates, news of the sealed estate was becoming impossible to contain. By morning, the private dispute had become a public symbol. Commentators debated Diana, Catherine, Camilla, and the strange power memory still held over the monarchy. Yet one moment captured the mood more powerfully than any studio argument. Outside Kensington Palace, a small group gathered beside the gates, and among the flowers appeared a handwritten card, bearing only a few words. "Keep what was hers with those she loved." Cameras fixed on it immediately. William saw the footage and felt the old pattern return. Kensington Palace, the London residence long associated with Diana and later with members of the Wales family, had once again become a place where private grief was being turned into public meaning. The archival confirmation was no longer being discussed simply as a dispute over possessions. It had become a larger question about who had the right to carry Diana's personal legacy into the next generation, and that mattered because every answer touched his family directly. Camilla watched the same coverage with growing dread. The palace communications team had issued only a restrained statement, confirming that private family archival arrangements were being respected and that no contents would be released. Even that careful language could not stop the headlines. The Queen Consort understood the danger immediately. Every argument about Catherine's custodianship risked reducing decades of her life to the same rivalry she could never answer without making it worse. William remained affected by the flowers outside Kensington. He knew those gestures came from public emotion, but he also knew how quickly emotion could harden into judgment. The prince had spent much of his life seeing his mother transformed into a symbol larger than any private memory he held. Now the sealed collection threatened to do the same thing again, only this time Catherine stood at the center of it. Catherine's restraint changed the tone. A major evening broadcaster centered its coverage on her refusal to display, publicize, or loan anything from the collection, describing her role not as that of a victor, but as a protective custodian. That framing mattered because it shifted the story away from humiliation and toward preservation. The future queen was not taking Diana's legacy from someone else. She was choosing not to exploit it at all. Anne recognized the difference immediately. In a private conversation later that evening, the Princess Royal admitted that Catherine had accomplished something confrontation never could. She had moved the public story away from Camilla's embarrassment and toward inheritance, memory, and responsibility. The anger was beginning to cool. The cameras could interpret the seal however they wished, but the final verdict belonged to the family members who had lived through what Diana's legacy still demanded of them. In the end, nobody walked away with a victory in the ordinary sense. Anne had confronted Camilla, but she had not driven her from the family. Catherine had gained authority over Diana's sealed legacy, but she refused to treat that authority as conquest. Charles had declined to interfere, accepting that some boundaries existed before his reign and deserved to survive it. And Camilla, faced with the permanence of that boundary, finally stopped asking whether it could be moved. Catherine made the final position unmistakable. The collection would remain sealed under continued archival protection, meaning the private records and possessions would stay preserved under controlled access rather than returned to ordinary palace use. Nothing could be reassigned, displayed ceremonially, or circulated without her approval. That mattered because Diana's estate would remain separate from general royal holdings, protected not as a monument to conflict, but as a family inheritance, with emotional meaning for William and his children. Charles accepted the arrangement as settled. The king understood that challenging it would reopen every wound the family had spent weeks trying to contain, and his decision ended any realistic chance of institutional interference. He would not ask archivists to reinterpret the instructions. He would not seek an exception. The monarch's silence had once seemed uncertain, but now it became final. Anne met Camilla again without the anger that had defined their first confrontation. The Princess Royal admitted that some of her words had been harsher than necessary, but she did not retreat from the boundary she had defended. Camilla accepted that distinction. The Queen Consort did not apologize for asking procedural questions, yet she agreed she would make no further request involving the sealed collection. For the first time, neither woman needed to win. William found his own closure privately. He thanked Catherine for refusing to turn his mother's possessions into a weapon against anyone. The prince told her that preserving Diana's dignity had mattered more than humiliating another member of the family. Catherine understood then what the entire crisis had really asked of her. Stewardship was not possession, it was responsibility without conquest, memory without revenge. The confrontation changed the monarchy because the family finally accepted a permanent boundary around Diana's private legacy. Anne defended it. Charles respected it. Camilla accepted it. Catherine inherited the duty to preserve it. And William finally gained certainty that his mother's memory would not be endlessly traded through palace battles. The door to Diana's sealed estate remained closed, but for the first time, that closed door did not represent another royal feud. It represented peace, a clear boundary around the past, a responsibility entrusted to Catherine, and a family finally choosing to preserve Diana's memory rather than continue fighting over it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.